pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation from the Academic Distinction Fund, and appreciate the work you do throughout the community and have for some time. It's a pleasure to get to present with Jeff. He and I guess I first met him down at the Capitol many years back, and my talk's gonna be a little bit different because I used to get a lot of quotes and scientific data from Jeff. So he's more the scientist, I'm more the cheerleader, and like to take information that's in the data and distill it down to audiences and put it into action for advocacy. And I think one of the frustrations that I'm sure those of you that have been early childhood educators or been involved in early childhood your whole careers, one of the frustrations might be that you've known this for 20, 30, 40 years. I happen to come along in the practice of medicine where I got pretty pictures to show you that it's true. So I like to proliferate the information from that level, and I feel for those of you that have been in the classroom for this many years, and you know, and your mom and dad and grandparents knew that this is where it was and didn't need a pretty MRI or a CT scan to give you the information, but kind of shame on us if we don't act on all this information now to kind of push the needle and move the needle a little quicker than we have. I'd just like to start by saying the problems of some are the responsibility of us all, and it's sort of why I guess it is that I end up working where I am and enjoy it, because I feel very blessed to have grown up in this community sort of south of Florida Boulevard, and my life now is on the north of Florida Boulevard, and there's some significant differences that affect us in this community and in other areas as well. I like to say there's nowhere to go but up in Louisiana in most categories. As an eternal optimist, these are just some of the data that many of you have seen and are familiar with. I will note that the last time I gave this talk, we were 49th in all those categories. So we have made some progress in terms of our infant mortality, child death, and in children in poverty. And that's from Kids Count, which is a great resource you may be familiar with. What's special about the brain? I was laughing when School Board President Freeberg was speaking. She could give my talk. She did a great job. This is the only organ you're born with that's not fully developed at birth, for the most part. Your brain, your heart, your kidneys, your lungs, other things pretty much function the way they are at birth, the way they will at death, except they're in miniature. The brain, on the other hand, is not fully developed at birth. It's only 25% of its adult weight at birth, so you got 75% of its physical growth line ahead of you. If you look at chimps or macaque monkeys, they're 45 or 60% of their adult weight at birth. So they don't have as much potential line ahead of them. And of course, that growth and potential, is pretty much dependent upon your caregivers and your environment. As she said earlier, you get to that brain size by about your third birthday. If you look at this chart, this is a head circumference growth chart for boys, and there's one for girls as well. And over on the left-hand side is months up until about that thick line in the middle where you get to 2 years of age. You just go over one more block, that's 3 years of age. The middle line is where half of all kids plot out, so 50% of all children. So you get to about 80 to 90% of your physical brain growth by your third birthday. And look, from 3 to 18, you don't have that much growth beyond that. So there's so much taking place because of the explosion of activity, literally, that's taking place with all the synaptic development. And all that is really dependent upon nutrition, your caregivers, the environment you're in terms of your outcome. This will be a little bit of review for you because Jeff did a nice job of going through this. And I'm not going to give you too much neuroanatomy, but this is basically the way the brain is organized. Each brain cell is called a neuron, and they believe now that neurons are actually kind of pre-programmed to migrate to certain areas of the brain where they're going to function for the rest of their existence. At birth, obviously, you don't need to know how to do algebra, but you have the neurons that will migrate out to your cerebral cortex, the outer part of your brain, to help with that executive functioning down the road. But at birth, it's located lower in your brain. And again, as Jeff was talking about, the only things that really have to function early on are those core areas. Then you have growth of axons and dendrites, synapses develop, they become myelinated, and you have this overproduction and pruning. This is just kind of a drawing of a bunch of neurons communicating with one another, and that gap down there where you see synapse, that's a very important piece of the puzzle, because these synapses are what allow us to function today, and those synapses are just exploding, as he was speaking about earlier. The little red things in there are your neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, sort of the chemicals of life that keep us in balance, hopefully. And so those are entering into that synaptic gap and then being reabsorbed by the next neuron or taken back up in the previous neuron and preserved. This is some myelination. This is a little bit different study than Jeff showed of what myelination looks like. And again, you start the top left with the 5-day-old brain. Those center areas of the brain are myelinated because, again, baby basically has to maintain his heart rate, his blood pressure. He's got to be able to cry, suck and swallow, pee and poop, I always say. Those are the main things that they got to be able to do to survive in the first few months of life. So that's the only thing that's myelinated. But look, by 2 months, you're getting more motor areas involved. They're starting to lift their head up a little bit. By a year, you can see it's actually probably better myelinated than an adult brain. And again, that comes into play because of the pruning and process that comes afterwards. We have about 100 billion neurons at birth. By the time and each brain cell can make 15,000 connections with the next one or others. So by the time you're 2, you have the same capacity as an adult. When you're 3, you have twice the capacity of your mom and dad. So that's why I frequently interject that it takes 2 adult brains to raise a 3-year-old. And again, then after that is what's kind of impressive that we've just learned is that you have this use it or lose it principle that takes place. And so between the third and fifth birthday now, it's expected that we lose 30 to 50% of those connections, which again, as we just pointed out earlier, much of that is a natural process and in order of efficiency. Just like if you had 10 electrical cords to plug in, it's much easier to stick them into a surge protector or a power strip and then plug 1 in the wall. So you've pruned 9 and improved the efficiency of the system. It's not that the 9 were unnecessary, but you did improve the efficiency, so you kind of got rid of those 9 connections. So by the time, we get to our 5th birthday, we're sort of at the adult level, and, we all turned out pretty well, right? So, but what can we do to preserve more of that connectivity and maximize that in all children? And you think about the advances. I was thinking the day I finished training in '94, and we just got the internet. I think I got my first email address in '95, and now, I can't function without this BlackBerry on my hip. No telling what we'll be doing if we further maximize or capitalize on the investment of our children's brain. Another example, just to point out, as Jeff did, on synaptic formation and when it actually takes place. This is from the same text, Neurons in the Neighborhood, that was mentioned earlier. And you can see there's a lot going on to the left of the slide from about 3 months pre-birth to about the birthday. And then you have this amazing amount of synaptic activity in the first 3 to 5 years of life. So, and it obviously progresses just like we develop with vision and hearing, language in green, and then your higher cognitive functioning to follow. So there's so much taking place. And I like to say that experience, well, I like to quote this person that says, experience in adults alters the organized brain, but in children, it organizes the developing brain. So it's a pretty simple way of looking at it, but it's actually true because you have all this newness and information to impart on our children, and we can actually organize their brains based on the amount of stress, toxic stress, good healthy environment versus environments full of risk. Speaking of risk, I wanted to mention one in particular because of where Louisiana typically is in its poverty scale. And we're about 20% of all U.S. children. Louisiana is 24%, and that has improved the past few years. But it can be a predictor of poor performance and low IQ in school. Many times it's not, well, absolutely it's not because the parents want that outcome for their children. The patients that I work with, about 96% of them qualify for free or reduced lunch, which I think about 85% of kids in East Baton Rouge Parish public schools qualify for. So you're already looking at, the majority of the kids in your schools, our school system, being impoverished. What that means is their lives are chaotic. It doesn't mean their parents don't want the same things that you and I want for our children. It just means that, where I have the luxury of, well, my wife has the luxury of being able to plan out what we're going to eat that week, go to the store in a car, buy it, bring it home, and kids that I take care of, their parents are more living day-to-day survival and don't have that luxury of making those kind of plans. So that environment is more chaotic. It doesn't mean they can't I don't want the things that you and I are able to provide for our children if we have more means, but it's because they're surviving day to day, so they're a little bit more distracted in day-to-day survival. These are just the 2011 poverty guidelines. For example, a family of 4, income is $22,350 a year. If you cut that in half, that's what extreme poverty is. Now, I haven't looked at this lately, but it used to be several years back that about 1 in 5 children in East Baton Rouge Parish lived in extreme poverty. So if you're at the mall or the store or somewhere and you count 5 children, 1 out of every 5 of those kids lives in an extremely impoverished background. So that's a big risk factor for our kids. Well, what about on the positive side? This was a study that I frequently quote. And what they did was they looked at kids that were impoverished, and they found that 80% of them plus required some special ed services or catch-up or remedial services when they got to elementary school or kindergarten, sort of what Superintendent Dilworth was referring to earlier. But 15% of that population they found thrived and did very well. So despite being impoverished and living in an impoverished background, something overrode poverty for that group of those kids. And what they found was they had a strong attachment, that someone had physically and emotionally invested in those babies in their first 3 to 5 years of life, whether it was a mom, a dad, a grandparent, maybe a caregiver, extended family member, maybe a daycare provider. Somebody made that child feel secure. And the way that attachment develops, it's a bond between infant and caregivers. Child cries, gets his need met. Child cries, gets his need met. Eventually, you don't have to cry to get all your needs met. Now, if you cry and your needs don't get met, sometimes you eventually just stop crying for a different reason. So there's a fine line with all that. But if you develop a strong attachment, which is basically the template for all the later relationships in life, and again, it's in those same areas of the brain that Jeff showed you with the circles that shows the same areas where memory and learning take place. You develop that strong attachment, it sets you up for lifelong success. If you don't, then you have this list of things that happens in your existence, where really the big one, I think, is lack of empathy. And empathy, obviously, is to feel for others and understand how your actions affect others. And fortunately, we don't have near the number of, we kind of had that rash of school shootings years back, and fortunately, we haven't seen many of those it seemed to be as prevalent. But the one that really disturbed me the most was a young man up in, I think, the Washington or Oregon area that was like 15, and then they went into the neighborhood and interviewed neighbors. Come to find out, he and his dad had not gotten along very well, and so the dad tried to invest some time with him, and what they decided to take up was a shooting and hunting or whatnot. And instead of starting with a BB gun or whatnot, he got like a rifle and a .22. So come to find out, when they were interviewing neighbors, he was just one of the neighbors just struck me because he said he was fine, and they kept to themselves, they didn't interact with us, and he was, normal 15-year-old on Prozac as any others in the neighborhood. And our 15-year-olds, while we have good medicines and they're very appropriately used for many kids, that shouldn't be the norm. It shouldn't be okay for that to sort of be the issue. And I think if you look back, we'll never, because of privacy issues, we're not going to really look back into the lives of a lot of these kids that have committed these different crimes. But if you see a picture of them, and I know it's not at their best moment, but they really seem to just be flat and kind of like ghosts, and you could probably just sense that they don't have a lot of empathy. And a lot of that probably had to stem way back into their early childhood, where they didn't have that good bond between mom and dad. This is the same study that Jeff referenced, and at the summation of that, they looking at environmental influence in the language in the low, middle, and higher income families. They counted up the words by their 4th birthday and found that low-income children were exposed to about 13 million words, and those with more means were 45 million. So just another amazing example of environmental influence. Now, mostly what we've talked about thus far is sort of just what's going on in the inner working of the brain. Well, look at, these are those pretty pictures I was talking about. These are 2 3-year-olds that basically had the same birth weight, but because of one environment was more neglectful or extremely neglectful than the other. And there's a genetic component to head size. It's not just the environment, but you can see the huge difference in head size in these 2 different 3-year-olds' brains, just in the physical size of it. Well, what about the quality of what's going on the inside? Well, there we go. This is called a PET scan, and what the red area, or the different colored areas, is the amount of absorption of glucose, sugar in our bloodstream which the brain mostly functions on glucose after it gets to a certain age. On the left, and this was from Time or something, so that's why the words are kind of a little more theatrical than I would like. An abused brain versus a healthy brain. This was from when they had some studies done on a lot of the children that came from the Romanian orphanages or the former Soviet bloc or Eastern Europe areas, and we were fortunately able to get some studies of these children. But you can see on the left that brain is got lots of activity, and those circular areas up there, the temporal lobes, the same areas we were talking about earlier where the toxic stress really affects you, and also is where your memory and learning is. There's not as much activity, physical activity at the cellular level in the brains of the children that didn't get that good exposure, or for whatever reason that the neurons just aren't there. So it sort of begs the question, well, can you get that back? And again, I'm not the scientist that some are, but you can go to conferences where they say, yep, the door's shut, you can't do anything about that. And so there's some data to suggest that's probably somewhat true, but I'm not the type to take away all hope. I think that a lot of, the brain is plastic, and depending on the environment and caregiver, it may take a lot more resources to re-energize those areas of the brain, but just to show you in pictures what could be the difference. I kind of break down the different types of environments this way. The preconception environment, before mom's even conceived, obviously, and looking at the health of mom and dad. That would be the ideal thing, is to have mom and dad be as healthy as possible before they even choose to have a baby. Then the prenatal environment, the first 40 weeks of our existence is in the womb. It's actually a 40-week pregnancy, so it's really 10 months. Sorry, ladies, it's not 9 months like we talk about. Y'all know that if you've had a baby. And then you have basically birth to 5. That's either going to be at home or in a developmental center. Then you have schools, where you're going to spend half of your awake life at school between your 5th and 18th birthday. So if you don't do as much as you can before they go off to school, there's not a lot of time left to impart what you want for your children. And again, half of your wake life is at school. There's still some of that at home. You're going to be sleeping. So it's not like there's a lot of time left to impact how your kids turn out. And then you have the community, basically, which I consider the built environment. So I like to think that the prenatal environment is a place we could focus. Somebody was asking about the magic bullet earlier, and I think, if we have healthier moms having healthier babies, we're going to have healthier outcomes in general, especially if you wrap around all babies born a good system of early childhood care. The whole scientific literature now is filled up with what's going on in the interaction of mom and dad's genes to create that baby, and that baby is born at 40 weeks or 38 weeks, sort of as a prepackaged bundle of genes that the environment will either trigger or not trigger disease to manifest itself later in life. You may have the propensity in your genes to be diabetic or hypertensive or overweight, but if the environment is structured such that you don't become overweight, maybe that gene is not triggered that sends you down that path of chronic disease. So that's sort of what we're beginning to learn. There was a veterinarian PhD that I met that gave a talk once and said we cross more biological milestones before we're born than we'll ever cross after we get here. And I think that's very true, because what he looked at, and others have looked at, is they looked at the Dutch hunger winter that the Germans imposed on the Dutch people, and looked at women and their babies, and looked at what point in their pregnancy they become famished, when they imposed basically starved a lot of those people. And they looked at the babies, and then they looked at the grandchildren of those moms that became malnourished during different points of pregnancies, and they found similar diseases in their children and grandchildren based on that malnutrition during different points in their pregnancy. So it's generational, and so really when you get down to it, those genes are very, very important in what helps determine whether we're going to develop disease later in life or not. So what about that early child care system? About 75% of all children from birth to 5 spend some time in non-parental child care, so that's a very good focus that we could emphasize in terms of making that environment as good as possible. The whole goal at the end of the day, well, not the only goal, but one of the main goals is school readiness, so that when we enter school ready to learn, we are ready to learn, and we don't have to spend time catching up. Now, the good news is that if you ask some principals, maybe some are here today, many kids that have come from just the worst of the worst background still exceed expectation from the beginning of the year to the end of the year on a lot of their standardized test scores. They achieve quite well. And they begin to override a lot of these issues that they had to deal with in their first 5 years of life. But we could do better than that if we really got them prepared to learn and ready to learn before they get to school. And that's part of the high quality child care experience. This is a study, it's a little dated, but basically if you look at the curve, the top curve is brain growth and the bottom one is public expenditures. This was done by the RAND Corporation. It's a little dated, and the good news is it's getting better. But if you go along the public expenditure curve, the first 5 years of life, traditionally we have not invested, and at 5 we start school, so boom, we start investing. That's exactly opposite of the way Mother Nature grows us. So the challenge would be to flip this public expenditure, and I'm not saying government can fix all this, but if you want to look at just the finances, if we financed our dollars on the way that our brains grow, we would eliminate a lot of these woes of society based on spending our money on the front end. There are things such as nurse-family partnership, nurse home visiting programs in Louisiana and other states, where by investing about $3,000 per year per child, you can send a nurse to scan the environment for risk factors and then put more services in for those children and their families before the baby's even born. And those have been proven to show great results, not only for the baby but for the parents in terms of space in the pregnancies, moms and dads going back to school, getting an education, entering the workforce. Just to give you some comparison, a prison cell costs about $76,000 to build and about $22,000 to $33,000 to maintain. Unfortunately, Louisiana ranks first in the nation in the number of citizens we have behind bars, and we're 1 in 26 if you count people on parole. So in the early childhood system, for every dollar you put into it, you get, depending on what study you look at, anywhere from $2 to $17 back. So you can pick where you would rather your money be spent. We don't want to be like this, and most states have this, but not all of them publish it. In Indiana and California, they look at their 2nd and 3rd grade literacy levels, 2nd and 4th, to determine the number of dollars they're going to need to invest in for prison beds. The one socioeconomic factor that inmates have in common, the most common one, is illiteracy. So, and our kids become literate by their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th grade, they're set up for long-term success. If they're not, they end up dropping out of school, or, well, they end up eventually, but they, cut up in class, then they, have behavioral issues, and we have to change schools, and then they end up becoming delinquent, and then they end up in the juvenile justice system, and on and on. So we know we can do better by spending more money on the front end. I'm glad y'all are going to hear more, probably from an economist or someone that really looks at this, because my idea is that if the economists notice, it'll get fixed, because it'll become about money. And this is an article from the Financial Times that I just happened to see. I don't read the Financial Times, but I saw a quote about it and said, this is great that the Financial Times is publishing something about early childhood or infant brain. It says, I don't particularly care for the, the catchy title, but Poverty Mars Formation of Infant Brains, which it does, and we've talked about that earlier, and talked about it poisoning the brain and whatnot. But at least the economists are putting this in their literature. And I think you'll see changes because of that. The Nobel laureate economist James Heckman basically was one of the slides that Jeff had and I had put in here that basically said there's really no excuse for investing our dollars any other way. To me, it's the purest form of economic development. It's got the best rate of return, and our science and data that we now have should drive the policy as opposed to what we've done. So I'd like to say it's time to close the gap between what we do, what we know, and what we do. Thank you. The benefit of early childhood education, depending on how you look at it, anywhere from $2 to $17 per dollar invested, you get back in return on investment. So that's the big message. I mean, it is a money thing, and if you start early, you reap the benefits of that many years later.
We can be very smart about how we invest in our children and how we invest long-term for our state. This is really where economic development is investing in people. And some states are doing a great job of that, and I hope that Louisiana is going to be one of those states, because the future of our state rests with our youngest children today. And if we want our state to be a leader in the decades to come, we need to improve our investments in early childhood.